Right, so today I really just want to talk to you a little bit about kind of non-adult osteology and the potential importance of this. So for some of you, this might be very familiar, or you might have lots of experience with working with non-adults. And for others of you, this might be something that you're just interested in, or you haven't worked with non-adults for a little while. So the way that I've kind of approached this is really taking different aspects of my current kind of research and things that I'm interested in and applying this to some of the challenges and problems that we face with non-adult osteology. So it's going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour today, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. And if you've got any questions, please do pop them in chat, and I think Sabrina's going to keep an eye on that. So if here. Okay, so just to introduce myself a little bit, really, I've been working with kind of non-adults and focusing on these young individuals for quite a long time now. So since my MSc, I've been really interested in working with these young individuals. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about my kind of research journey and where I've come from and why this is something that I've kind of specialized in. So I looked at kind of fetal and perinatal and infant individuals for my MSc, and then I wanted to further this, and I conducted my PhD actually here in Durham under the supervision of Professor Becky Gowland, and my project was called Stressed at Birth. And this was really a project thinking about looking at evidence for growth disruption, what's the kind of implications of thinking about growth disruption for health. So can it be used as a proxy for health? But within that, obviously thinking about and incorporating and considering the kind of challenges then of our age estimation kind of methods, pathological lesions, which I'll talk about during this talk as well, because this is kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about non-adults, because it's so difficult very often to really kind of understand what we're looking at and to kind of consistently record what we're seeing. And then also I'm really interested in thinking about that mother-infant nexus, so the maternal kind of relationship between these really young individuals and the mothers who obviously, gave birth to them or perhaps didn't, and thinking about the kind of experiences of those mothers in past societies, but also what these kind of really young lives, the experiences that these really young individuals might have had. I was then really lucky on finishing my PhD to have a British Academy fellowship so I moved to Reading University and worked with Professor Mary Lewis, and my project there was called Bringing Up Babies. So this was really to expand and extend on my research, thinking about growth disruption and health disruption, but kind of looking and approaching this in slightly different ways and using new technologies. And these are some of the things that I'll touch on today. But before we go into the kind of research, I just wanted to talk about why these things are relevant to us today, and why it's kind of relevant for us to think about these really young individuals and this kind of early period of life. So we know that pregnancy and birth and the early postnatal period are, these really precarious points in life. They are the most precarious points in life. Birth is particularly challenging and difficult, and it's where we're susceptible to all sorts of kind of things. But we also know that these really young individuals, so these kind of fetal and perinatal individuals, they have this huge amount of skeletal plasticity. So they're able to reflect their environment much more readily than an adult. So what I mean by this is that their bones are able to reflect their kind of health disruption or growth disruption. They can tell us a lot more and more quickly than an adult can. So children are really these kind of sensitive barometers of health. And we know that there are high neonatal and infant mortality rates even today. So you can see in 2016, actually still 1,300 babies died in the first 28 days of life in the UK. And globally, there's 15 million that were born prematurely. So thinking about this kind of early life period and the consequences of things that might go wrong during this period is still really relevant today. Other things that then we need to think about and consider that make us think about how we might interpret this in the past, or think about the factors that might affect some of our archaeological individuals are things like structural inequality or even urban living. Now, of course, I'm not saying they're exactly the same in the past as they are today, but we know some of these inequalities, and we know that some of these environments and some of these conditions are particularly challenging and do affect younger individuals, and also disproportionately. So you can see I've just picked out some kind of statistics here, thinking about kind of birth rates and deaths per live births that differ by country, by geographic region. It also depends on your access to healthcare. So even in the UK, there's a real discrepancy between those living in deprived areas versus those in kind of higher status areas. If we think about the consequences of urban living as well, so there was a study done by Guy's and St Thomas, and even they found that there's thinking about the kind of life course, and if you're a sick kind of infant and child, what is the kind of longevity and the impact of those things on your well-being and health. And they found that life expectancy differs as well. So you can see that there's up to a 13 to 15-year difference in health expectancy even between London boroughs today. And a lot of this becomes locked in quite early on in childhood. So these really early periods of our life are really quite important. So the way I kind of approach this is thinking about how all of that we can kind of maybe start to think about and access, but what are for us also the archaeological challenges of dealing with these really young individuals. So if we're taking this from kind of an osteological point, which obviously that's why we're all here, we know that skeletal analysis is really important, and it's kind of the best practice. It's the best way that we're going to be able to get information from these individuals, is looking at the bodies and the skeletons of these individuals themselves. As I said, we know that there's an importance of these early life experiences on life course well-being. So it's not only that kind of immediate health and well-being of that individual, but because of kind of, we know now things like the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis. We know that some of these kind of health challenges can become, like I said, locked in and can affect your overall kind of life course well-being and health. So actually thinking about these detrimental impacts that we might experience as children is then thinking about, well, how are we seeing that in our adult population as well? Because sick children go on to be sick adults. And, if those sick adults are then having, again, children, what is that kind of generational effect of that? We know that there's this kind of focus now on maternal infant interactions, and we're able to we keep pushing that boundary back a little bit further. So we're able to get further and further into in utero life, which is really great. But there are, of course, these ongoing limitations, misconceptions, difficulties, and challenges of interpretations. So I'm sorry, there's obviously a timing thing on some of these slides, so I'll just keep flipping backwards. So some of the assumptions, obviously, that kind of are held within the archaeological community are like that infants are small, they're complicated, they're difficult to identify, you're going to get more limited amounts of information from them compared to an adult. I mean, I've seen in older texts, they've actually been written as being completely worthless in analysis. And I know, we've moved away from this substantially today, but there is still this perception that they're quite challenging, because ultimately they are tiny. You've got very, very tiny pieces of bone to deal with. Some of the things look a little bit different to what you see in an adult. So there are challenges there of working with them. Obviously, the identification and actually finding them on archaeological sites can be challenging. And then there's the suite of methodological issues, which is really what I'm kind of going to focus on today. But initially, what I want to do is think about the assumptions. So like I said, kind of taken some case studies from my own work and thinking about my own research and tried to apply it to some of these challenges. And I think challenging kind of traditional assumptions or long held assumptions, it really had to be a kind of Roman case study that I wanted to kind of present to you, because this is where Roman infants are so often interpreted as being victims of infanticide. And this is kind of quite a commonplace theory that's being kind of held across lots of different sites. What's really interesting, though, is that from a kind of more contextual perspective and looking at other kind of evidence, and so you can see here from kind of depictions in art, we've got a epigraphic kind of depiction as well, and even some written kind of text and things. We know that Romans, to some respect, they really valued their children. They went to a lot of effort to educate their children, look after their children. There is this idea that they treated them a little bit like mini adults. But again, I think sometimes we place our kind of modern perspectives and our modern attitudes onto these kind of past communities. And I think we need to take a little bit of a step back sometimes. So I this is a slide that I very often show because I think it's it really just shows you, one, how much Google has improved, how much AI has changed things, but also just the change in kind of attitudes. So the left column is a Google search. You can see at the top I've put Roman infants in, and that is from 2018, and I captured the results there. The right-hand column is a Google search of Roman infants from 2023. So not only you can see that in 2018 there were 637,000 results. By last year, or a couple of years ago, there were 57 million results for Roman infants. So there's obviously, it shows there's kind of been a little bit of a explosion in terms of interest. But it's really interesting to look at the kind of results that you're getting. So in 2018, you can see that the narrative of infanticide is absolutely there. So you can see infanticide, you can see why were newborn children left to die, bones of Roman era babies killed. It's all that kind of narrative associated with infanticide. The Google search from 2023, it's still not great. It's still not, kind of looking at all the different ways that we've explored the lives of Roman infants. But you can see that shift where the kind of the narrative more seems to be about exposure of infants rather than necessarily infanticide, which I think is really interesting. So the concept or the perception seems to have changed a little bit, but there is still this kind of prevalence or predominant kind of thinking of Romans and killing babies. What this, of course, misses is all of the other kind of research that's been done. And this is literally just, these are just some really very small examples in terms of ones I just grabbed and put together. There's a huge body of work from all sorts of authors who have looked at Roman infants and done lots of work to kind of overcome and think about Roman infants in different ways. But the one that you're perhaps most familiar with, or perhaps you've seen in the news, and it was quite a big thing when it was kind of released, was the Roman villa at Uden. So this was a study done in 2011, or it was published in 2011, where the interpretation of infants being killed and infanticide being practiced was really based on the prevalence or the number of infants recovered from this site. Now, Uden, the reason I'm bringing it up is because I'm actually working on the Uden villa individuals at the moment. So I'm afraid I can't kind of talk about results at the moment, but I can compare it to one of the other sites that I have looked at. So this was really a study that was conducted that aged all of these infants and said there's so many infants that were recovered from this Roman villa, and they aged them all, and they said, look, they're all kind of clustering around the point of birth at 40 gestational weeks. That seems a little bit unusual. Therefore, it's probably because they were killing them. Now, obviously, I somewhat would like to challenge that opinion, I suppose, and other publications have done that previously. But thinking about other sites, it's this idea that finding Roman infants and finding babies amongst these kind of inhabitation sites is unusual, but actually it isn't. If we look at a whole suite of other Roman villas from, different places and different counties, you see a really, really similar pattern. So this is a site that I've worked on for a really long time. And actually, I've got a few more than 35 individuals now, but I need to finish the analysis of those. So you can see that these individuals are very, very kind of similarly placed around these inhabitations and dwellings and very similar kind of contexts. So I think we need to think about whether location in this kind of period and this kind of era really is a justification for this. Similarly, at Dorchester Roman Town House, you get a similar kind of pattern. So of course there are fewer individuals here, but in terms of locations, they're very similar. And what's really interesting to think about number of individuals and the number of infants that we find on these sites. Very few people ever think about the number of infants and then think about the kind of longevity of the site in general. Very often these Roman villas are in existence for 200-300, if not more years. Now, of course, without carbon dating all of the individual burials, it's hard to know, what point in time they're clustering to. But the potential is that all of these individuals are from quite a long period of time. And what we have to remember is as well that it might not have just been one family living in these settlements. You might have had a couple of families, you might have workers and domestic kind of helpers on the site as well. So again, these individuals might not all be from a single mother. So I think we just need to kind of think about our kind of interpretations a little bit more in terms of the context. In terms of, as well, the numbers of individuals, what I should say about the Uden site is that I think it was excavated in 1912, and it was reported then that there were 97 individuals excavated from that site where infanticide has been kind of interpreted. But I don't think anybody has ever seen all 97 individuals. Now, that might not mean that there weren't 97, but I suspect maybe some were not actually whole burials, or maybe one individual was numbered as two individuals, or maybe some were faunal remains. I'm not sure. So, there might be some kind of, issues around that numbering as well. So I think it's just things for us to think about. This next slide, I really just want to show you. So this is Dorchester Townhouse, but I just want to show you this picture because what they've done is put these kind of little memorials for where the infant burials were found, which are just these little kind of concrete squares. And I thought that was really lovely because very often you can go to these sites and they'll talk about and interpret kind of adult burials, but there's often no markers for some of the infant burials. And we know that there would have been infant burials at a lot of these kind of sites. And I thought this was just a really nice and subtle way of kind of showing that. So I just wanted to add that in. So like I said, I can't talk about the Uden work that we're doing at the moment with my collaborator Rebecca Pitt down at Reading. But what I can talk about is some of the work that we did on the Piddington individuals, which was the second site I just showed you. Because again, it's a site with 30 to 40 fetal remains. As the crow flies, it's actually not that far from Uden Villa. And it's another site that people have definitely said to me, oh, do you think infanticide is happening? And so I was really lucky to be able to work with Becky Gowland and Professor Janet Montgomery and Dr. Nick Stewart down at Brighton to kind of test and evaluate the new peptide method. So the peptide method is a new kind of way of being able to biologically sex our individuals in a minimally destructive way. So it's using the dentition, and what you can do is take a little kind of acid etch of the kind of surface of the enamel of the tooth, and what it does, it leaches out, it draws out these kind of peptides that we know to be sexually dimorphic. And, Becky and Janet and Nick had tested this on known individuals, adults, but we wanted to see if it would work on really, really young individuals. And so we tested a range of individuals and included some of my perinatal individuals from Piddington, which was fantastic. So some of these you can see are really young, they're kind of 40 gestational weeks, so they're really, really tiny tooth cusps. And we got brilliant results. So I'll just move on here. So you can see these are all the ones that we tested. And actually we got a kind of a mixture, but actually we got more male individuals. So this is again, assuming that we're taking that interpretation of infanticide, that it would be the females being deliberately killed with the males kind of prioritized. The pattern that we're getting in terms of our kind of biological sex is not consistent with that. So this was actually a really nice finding for me to kind of, something I kind of wanted to push back on, but this really helps substantiate that. So moving on in terms of then thinking about kind of other methodological issues, age and kind of growth status and interpreting evidence of growth disruption is obviously one of my kind of key areas to think about. But as some of you will be very familiar with, age is a really complicated thing to try and establish, even though this is a kind of rapidly growing individual and we know there's kind of these clear points of development. Actually, if you've got an individual who's kind of potentially unwell and is not growing in that normal pattern, it's kind of being able to capture that. Also, we know that we're all using really inconsistent terminology. So what is a perinate to me might not be a perinate to you. So that's something else that kind of sometimes muddles the waters a little bit, shall I say. And then it's got the kind of the use of applicable and accurate methods. So there are real kind of limitations with the methods that we're currently using. And there's not really much we can do about that because they are the established methods. So people are obviously working to create new methods and improve these. But sometimes all we can do is the best that we can with what we've got at the moment. So again, I'm just going to show you kind of a case study just to highlight this and show you kind of evidence of growth disruption and how I kind of go about it and how I think you can potentially try to capture this. So again, we're going to use my Piddington individuals, but then also some Roman individuals from Barton Court Farm and some Iron Age individuals from Aylesbury. So you've kind of got three different but relatively close sites. And you can just see that for all of these, I kind of just looked at different elements to do age estimation. So for as many as possible, I looked at their dentition for age, but then also at the long bones. So where I could, I recorded obviously absolutely everything. So this is just a graph showing you all of the dental ages plotted, all of the age estimations that I got from all of the long bones plotted, and they're just plotted together. So what you can see is that for all the dentitions that I was able to age, they range from 34 gestational weeks to 58 gestational weeks. Now, I know that gestational weeks should stop at about 40 because that is the kind of considered normal point of birth, but just to make it easier to kind of think about, I've just converted postnatal months into gestational weeks. So you can see that dental ages are giving me quite a big age range. If we then compare that to the femur, you can see that they're only ranging then from 36 weeks to 43 weeks gestational age. And you can see that the other long bones are doing the same. So we've got this real clustering of ages for all of our long bones, but a much broader kind of spread of ages for our dentition. Now, of course, because this isn't plotted by individuals, it's hard to know, maybe I'm just plotting apples and oranges here. So what I then did was plotted each individual with where they had dental age, and then where I was able to take an age estimate from their long bone. And what you can see, so blue is the dental aging, and they've all got their error bars on, so that's why it looks slightly unusual. And then you can see all the different kind of colours for the long bones. What you can see at the beginning, so towards the left-hand side of the graph, is that those long bone ages and the dental ages relatively consistent. Sometimes the long bone age is actually almost they're older than the dental ages that I've signed. However, you can see from the middle of the graph onwards, what you start to get is this drop off in the skeletal ages compared to the dental ages. And what's really interesting is obviously by the end of that, so on the right-hand side of the graph, you've got 3 individuals where their long bone ages and their error bars don't even overlap with the error bars of the dental age estimates. And what I should say in those, where those error bars of the dental ages are the big ones, that's actually a plus or minus of 3 months. So that's actually quite a lot of time. That's a large gap. So if there is no overlap between those two things, that's suggesting a real discrepancy between the kind of dental aging and the long bone. Now, because dental aging is kind of what we consider to be more reliable, dental development is more genetically regulated, it's likely to reflect chronological age much better. I'm kind of taking dental ages as the kind of it's not a known age, but the best age I can get for that individual. Whereas to me, the skeletal ages, the ages I'm deriving from those long bones, are perhaps going to be showing some more adversity. And I think what's really interesting is that clustering on the left-hand side, where they're all quite similar and the dental and long bone ages match, they're all my individuals that you can see are 40 gestational weeks or under. So they are actually in utero. And what we see is this drop off in the postnatal period. And of course, the longer that individual or the older that individual is getting, it seems to be that drop off, that difference in age estimates gets wider. So is this related to the postnatal environment? Are these infants being born into really stressful environments? Are they not being fed particularly well, or are there other environmental factors? Also, we can't ignore the methodological challenges of the long bone age kind of estimation method. And I won't kind of go into that, but it could be as well that the kind of those long bone ages, you can see they're all actually quite homogenous across the board. So maybe there's just a problem with that. However, what I would say is the fact that these 3 have really dropped off, that there is not any overlap, for me, that's when I say definitely that there is growth disruption, that their skeletal development, that their skeletal growth is not matching their dental growth. And so we're getting this real discrepancy in ages. So this is something that I'm taking a little bit further. So this is something that I'm still working out effectively. This is kind of new for me. So any thoughts, that will be really useful. And I'll show you some of my kind of preliminary data. But I really want to start thinking about small for gestational age and intutoring growth restriction. We take all of these measurements, we think about growth and development, we correlate that to kind of age, or we use it to give an age estimate. But actually, there must be individuals out there that have small for gestational age or intutoring growth restriction, and we're not capturing them. Or can we capture them is really my question. And how do we go about doing that? So small for gestational age is when somebody is just small, but they are genetically small. And ultimately, their proportions are symmetrical. So, limbs are a left limb to a right limb should be the same in terms of growth. Intutoring growth restriction, however, is where you start to see asymmetrical growth, and it can be associated with all sorts of kind of fetal infections and various things. So I'm interested again in kind of thinking about growth disruption and looking more keenly at individual bones in terms of growth, and then thinking about that with pathology. But just to show you some kind of very preliminary data, I suppose. So this is that same graph that I just showed you with my individuals, and I was talking about the 3 that are dropped off at the end. So you can see that I've highlighted 2 in yellow and 1 in green. So the 2 in yellow, I would say absolutely, they have growth disruption because there's no overlap between the age estimates. The 1 highlighted in green, maybe it's kind of just clinging on there. So it's kind of one of the ones right on the edge. When we look at then the long bones in terms of both left and right, thinking about asymmetric growth. What's really interesting is that Piddington 19, so if I just flip back, Piddington 19 is the one highlighted in green here. This does seem to have some asymmetric differences. There is a difference between left and right femoral length. And you can see that for other individuals, there's a little bit of variation. Some are almost spot on. But for that individual where there is potentially growth disruption, you can see that there is this difference. Conversely, however, in the two individuals where I would say there was definitely growth disruption, you can see that their measurements are almost exactly spot on. Their left and right measurements are almost on top of one another. You can barely see the difference. And that for me is really interesting because, you know, the two highlighted in yellow were absolutely showing evidence of growth disruption, but they're not asymmetrical. So I just wonder if we can begin to look at this to start to capture maybe evidence of small for gestational age versus intrauterine growth restriction. Now, of course, that ignores all of the potential kind of environmental factors and all the other health things that might be impacting growth. But I think it's really interesting. And so then I thought, well, what about diaphyseal width? Because we know that, yes, long bone length is affected by stress, but actually cortical thickness of bone is much more affected by stress than length. And so I took my Piddington individuals here. And again, what I just did was compared left and right diaphyseal kind of width for the individuals that I could. And what you can see here is that burial 19, which was the one that was showing differences in length, you can see here, no difference in width. But then some of the others are starting to show differences in width. And so I thought, well, maybe this is just me. Maybe my measurements are really off. Maybe I'm just really bad at taking these measurements. But what was really nice is that actually some of these individuals started to crop up again. So this is the data from the humerus. And so you can see that again, burials kind of 5, 24, they're again showing these bigger lateral differences. The fact that I'm picking it up in the same individuals, and I can confirm this pattern is repeated in other bones as well. Obviously, I'm just kind of highlighting this for you. That makes me believe that those differences might be more real than me just being not able to measure left and right consistently. And I wonder if this is a way in which we can start to capture some of this kind of evidence or some of these early life course experiences by actually really being very particular about what we're measuring, but also thinking about it in different ways and not just for aging purposes. What I should say is that, and this is incredibly preliminary, is that I'm really interested as well in whether there is a sex difference here between males and females in terms of growth and prioritization of growth. And I've got a very, very limited and small sample, but males seem to be growing in one pattern and females in another, which again, it's really exciting. But also I think that's what makes me think these patterns might also be real. And so that's my kind of work for the future and what I'm kind of moving on to doing now. Now, the other methodological issue, which I couldn't not touch on really, is obviously pathology. It is the most direct evidence we have for thinking about health and disease in the past. And it's something that in perinatal and infant individuals is just so incredibly challenging for a variety of reasons. And I just picked some images here because some of these are quite unusual and they're not things that you see so commonly. But also, I think some of these things are perhaps missed. And I always highlight the picture that's right in the very middle. For those of you that are osteologists, if you saw those, you might kind of mistake them actually for like zygomatics or zygomas, but they're actually frontal bones. And it's frontal bones where the rest of the cranial vault, the squama, actually hadn't developed. So, some of these things, I think, it's that we're just not recognizing, or perhaps due to taphonomic damage or not having kind of precise recordings of some of these things actually in situ means that when we're getting them to the lab, we're not particularly identifying them. So I think there's just so much more that we could be looking at. But of course, the real kind of problem is obviously periosteal new bone formation. So this is the bone formation that we record on our long bones. And this has been a kind of perpetual problem for a really long time. And I'll be completely honest that I was incredibly naive at the start of my PhD, and I thought that I was going to solve this problem. And it's been several years and I'm no closer and probably further away from solving it, because it's just so incredibly difficult. And the more I read and the more I think about it, the more confused I get. So I'm not going to tell you a magical answer, I'm afraid, of how to record periosteal new bone formation, but I think there's a couple of things we could be doing to maybe help. So obviously periosteum being that kind of layer that we get around the diaphyses of the long bones. And this is what lays down new new bone appositionally onto that kind of external cortical surface. And this process is the same for normal physiological growth, but also for pathological growth. And of course, distinguishing then between the two is really challenging, and particularly because these individuals should be growing. And that's that's the main challenge, isn't it? Is this related to normal growth or is this pathological? And I just found this really nice image just to show the kind of difference between the periosteum, because this is one of the challenges, right? The periosteum is just thicker, it is more active, it's just it's laying down more bone in our kind of young individuals. So the fact that we're getting higher rates of periosteal new bone formation in our young individuals shouldn't be unexpected. They should be doing that. They should be growing. They should have this new bone formation. However, it's where is that cutoff point between normal and pathological? So I've just got a couple of pictures here because I think this really showcases, I think sometimes we don't know what we're recording, or people are recording everything, or some people are recording nothing, and that's kind of the problem. And this isn't to kind of call anybody out or anything like that, but I suspect some people will be recording new bone formation and the image on the left. Some people will be recording new bone formation and the image on the right. Some people might record both, some none, because it can be challenging to think about where new bone formation is pathological. And what I want to do is really, I'm just going to talk through some of the kind of existing research, but then the ways that I've been approaching this to try and think about this, because I'm not sure if we can really get to the bottom of distinguishing it, but I think we need to establish patterns of age and location to think about where it might be more normal and common and where it might be less normal and common. So in terms of the clinical perspectives of new bone formation, there's been quite a bit of work on this. And actually, it's a really kind of burgeoning area because they're working on lots of different procedures related to the periosteum because of its rejuvenating features. So there's actually quite a lot of work coming out now because they're doing tests on kind of grafting the periosteum onto different pieces of bone to see how it heals. So actually, hopefully, our understanding of the periosteum will improve. So obviously there's been lots of work though about the kind of pathology of this in terms of, so the kind of original paper was Schopfner in 1966, which said, it should be symmetrical in infants because that's growth. But then you've also got kind of later works by Rauch that say, well, we should expect a minimum amount of new bone formation in infants. That's completely fine. They're growing. But obviously then different bones have different rates of growth. And so we need to understand that to think about the differences in the new bone formation we might be seeing. Kwon et al. Did a paper in 2012 that has become quite widely cited, and they say that if the new bone formation, if you can measure it, if it's under 2 millimeters in thickness, that's completely normal. If it's between the ages of 1 to 4 months. So, by kind of extrapolation, anything beyond those parameters is thus kind of abnormal. Now, of course, the challenge with this is, well, what happens in individuals who are under 1 month of age and over 4 months of age, they don't stop growing. And also, what if a kind of pathological condition is just starting? You don't wake up one day and suddenly have 2 millimeters of new bone formation. What is the process? How long does it take to get to that? So, I've got lots of questions, but this is just kind of a little bit of an overview of where we're at clinically. So one thing I did was created a grading system. And again, this is by no means perfect. It's a work in progress. It was just something that I thought might be useful to help me try and distinguish between different levels of new bone formation, because it's really difficult to record it. And, sometimes you just know that the kind of new bone formation you're looking at is more than the previous kind of bone you've looked at, but it's hard to quantify it. There isn't a way of doing it. So I created this kind of grading system. So again, any thoughts, much appreciated. So applying that to my actual archaeological samples, I looked at pathology in, as you can see, 423 individuals here from 15 different populations. And this is just looking at kind of the number of bones. And so perhaps not unexpectedly, in terms of pathology in general, tibia most, followed by the femur and then the humerus. In terms of type of pathological change, new bone formation was by far always the most common. This was the thing that I picked up the most, which again, these are young, potentially growing individuals. Is this kind of unexpected? Probably not. But when you're getting an 82% rate of new bone formation on the tibia, I did start to question if this is really pathological, or is this just actually quite normal, because 82% is really quite high. And that's just what it looks like in terms of the bones. So again, like I said, the tibia is by far showing the highest amount, followed by the femur, and then the humerus. And again, if we're thinking about kind of growth and the prioritization of growth, where would we expect to see it? Again, this doesn't, this kind of aligns with the bones that we'd expect to see growing. So, challenging. Then thinking about the type of new bone formation that I observed, and again, almost always it was woven new bone formation. And again, you can see in my tibias, I'm getting a 92% rate of woven bone formation compared to anything else. And again, this just kind of makes me, I suppose, uncomfortable, in the sense that this just seems really very high, and I'm just not sure if this then is associated with pathology. It just makes me nervous when I see percentages like this. And so, yeah, I think we just need to kind of maybe think about what this means. I then thought, well, you know what? I'll have a think about this by dental age. And so you can see, in terms of number of individuals, my biggest kind of frequency of individuals are in those age ranges of 46 and 52 gestational weeks. You can see I've kind of got 50, 30 individuals in each group for all of the bones. However, in terms of rates of pathology, it's actually those younger individuals where I'm getting higher percentages of new bone formation being present. So even though I'd expect potentially to see more in my kind of groups where I have just more individuals to look at, I'm not. But consistently, it's kind of those 38 to 40 week individuals potentially having a growth spurt around birth where I'm seeing a lot of this new bone formation. So I think this is kind of a really important point, is that we need to think about pathology, yes, but we also need to think about the age of the individual on which we're identifying that pathology. Because when it is so closely entwined with growth, and when it's so difficult to think about pathology as being either growth or pathology, then I think kind of looking at it by age is really important to do. I then did it with my little grading system, thinking about grade, and you can see that ultimately, actually, I kind of clustered everybody into grade 2. So I've got a few individuals in grade 1, a few individuals in grade 3, and a lot in grade 2. So this is not a perfect system, because I suspect those in grade 1, it's probably not pathology. If we're being very crude and saying grade 1, not enough to be pathology, grade 3, definitely pathology. Grade 2 is kind of where I'm like, I don't really know. And so I'm clustering everybody into that group. So it's not a perfect method, but I just want, again, I think it might be a way of starting to kind of tease apart individuals. At least this way I can say, I've definitely got 11 individuals where I think they've got grade 3 new bone formation. I think that is definitely pathological, whereas the rest I'm not sure about. Because at the moment, what we're doing is just all recording kind of pathology, new bone formation, tick, without really pulling apart and being very specific about the changes we're seeing. Now, to further that, because of this kind of work that's been done thinking about the thickness of periosteal new bone formation, I did another kind of analysis thinking about this thickness using radiology. And so what I'm looking at here, so you can see the image on the left shows no kind of new bone formation, but the image on the right, you can almost see like a double contour of, the kind of cortical surface, and there's the kind of small black line, and then another kind of white line, and that's suggesting that there is a layer of new bone formation on top. So that was the kind of change that I was looking at. And what I was then doing was measuring that second kind of layer, measuring how thick that was. So I did this for another group of individuals, so not related to the ones that I've just showed you. And in total, I had 163 long bones that I assessed. So I assessed them macroscopically. I thought that 30 long bones had evidence of new bone formation. And you can see here that, again, the pattern, so completely different samples, get the same pattern: tibia, femur, humerus, and it's always the same. So again, I'd be really interested if you're all seeing similar patterns as well. Again, when I looked at the grading, you can see that I actually had more in grade 1 here. Then I had quite a few in grade 2, and then only one individual in grade 3. Of all those bones that I radiographed, so of all 163 long bones that were assessed, only 5 actually showed radiological evidence of new bone formation, had that double contour. Interestingly, all 5 of those bones were femora, so not a single tibia, even though it was a tibia that I'd scored as grade 3. And absolutely none of that new bone formation is over 2 millimeters in thickness. So if we're using that kind of clinical definition established by Kwan et al., technically none of it's pathological. Now, as I said, there are limitations to that, because what if something is just developing? What if that condition is kind of only just, the individual's only been suffering for a short amount of time? It might be that the periosteum isn't quite 2 millimeters thick yet, or the new bone formation, sorry, isn't 2 millimeters thick yet. And I think some of these individuals, particularly that individual you can see in the image on the left, I would suggest does show evidence of new bone formation consistent with being pathological. So, even if we're not sticking exactly to some of these definitions, I think applying some of these methods and looking at this in a slightly different way, again, might help. So this is just a slide. So this is all unpublished data. So I'm not going to tell you where this one is from, I'm afraid. But you can see here, so this collection of individuals, as you can see, have all sorts of pathological changes, and you can see from the radiographs that they do have obviously lots of other indicators of being in poor health. But this is probably the best evidence that I've seen of new bone formation in a radiograph. But actually, other than the image in the middle, not a single one of these individuals measures at over 2 millimeters in thickness, even though you can see the kind of trabecular and cortical structures are just really, they're not looking how they should be looking, and you can see, the changes within them. So, I think it's just something we need to think about. So very quickly, because I know we're getting to the end of time, so I just wanted to very quickly touch on kind of the endocranial lesions, which again is something very similar that we have challenges with. So obviously this is primarily thinking about those kind of actual cranial vault bones. And again, I suspect many of us are using the system established by Mary. There isn't really any kind of update on this. And so this is something that I think we probably do need to update. And I think there's, we're all recording slightly different things again. So again, I had a kind of similar grading system for my cranial lesions. And you can see kind of here, so grade 1 for me is something where you can see something, but it almost looks like it merges with the surface of the bone. Grade 2 is a more kind of isolated patch, and grade 3 is much thicker. It's kind of clearly pathology. But what I've subsequently done since is actually added a grade 0, because I suddenly realized that unless we're also recording the individuals who have no pathology, we're not getting true patterns of pathology, because we need to know individuals who don't have pathological changes and think about their ages, their overall health status. Do they show evidence of growth disruption if we're truly going to kind of create a bigger pattern and understanding? So this is something I need to kind of go back and add in because this is kind of a retrospective thing that I've added. So just very quickly, I looked at endocranial bone formation in 523 individuals. You can see they're 30 gestational weeks to actually up to a year. So I had a bit older individuals here. So again, you can see this is just by grade. Interestingly, like for my parietals and occipitals, I've got more kind of grade 0s and grade 1s, and the frontal is fairly consistent. In terms of types of new bone formation, and again, I'd be really interested if you're seeing similar patterns, because I suspect you are, is that in the frontal and parietal and the endocranial surfaces of these, you're actually getting most of the time lamellar new bone formation with a little bit of woven potentially mixed in. But for the occipital, you're getting that woven bone formation very often around that cruciform eminence. And so there's this real kind of pattern and distinction between the two. And it does seem to be fairly consistent amongst individuals. So again, my question is, actually, if we're seeing these things, is it normal? Is it growth related because of the way we know that the cranial bones develop? So just quickly, this was all of the affected kind of frontals, parietals, occipital bones plotted by age. And you can kind of see these curves. So you can see that there's a curve with the frontal in terms of frequency, parietal, occipital, and there does seem to be this age-related kind of change. And I think it's really interesting that this exists, because it kind of also correlates with the growth and development. And so this is something that I think we need to kind of figure out and think about a lot more. Something I'm certainly thinking about is matching up pathologies to age and normal patterns of growth, because I think until we do that and establish that, it's very difficult to know what is, abnormal. So in terms of just then kind of the challenges of this, obviously true pathology is, the biggest hurdle of all is actually knowing what really is pathology and what isn't, particularly in relation to that periosteal new bone formation and the endocranial lesions. I don't think it means we shouldn't record it. I think we should absolutely record it. I just think we need to record also when it isn't present, to really begin to kind of think about that and interrogate that a little bit more. And then, like I said, we need to think about kind of the actual element that's assessed, the location of it, what are the extent of the changes, the age of the individual, and also the characteristics of that pathology, because I think some pathologies potentially just show up more commonly or more frequently on some bones than others. And it's thinking about those patterns and consistencies. Just to finish, for those of you who are kind of field osteologists or lab osteologists or whatever, I've actually made some really bespoke recording forms for kind of infant and perinatal individuals. They're freely downloadable. So if you think that they would be useful, then please do just follow the links and get them. So just download them. I kind of designed them to try and be helpful in both the identification of all the tiny little bones, but also they're kind of age appropriate. So they kind of some of the skeletal elements appear as they should. So where some things haven't kind of fused yet, or epiphyses haven't developed, they're not included in the recording forms, but then in the older age category they are. So it might also help think about aging of individuals as well. So really then, just to kind of round up, what's the importance and potential of non-adult osteology? So obviously, I think it's so important in being able to reveal kind of these new insights into early life experiences. And like I said, the considerations for later life health as well. That relationship with the mother, but also the wider community. So, like I said, they're sensitive barometers. So they actually provide a lot of information for us to understand the wider kind of social and community health. It might help us think about kind of the social roles and values of non-adults too, and how wider community perhaps treated these. And we can begin to kind of access new aspects of these lives, from thinking about growth and health and well-being, but also like new methods such as bioerosion and peptide analysis. We can start to think about new aspects of these really early life experiences, and I think that's really important. And there are obviously lots of methodological limitations, but I think it's really worth pursuing to kind of try and overcome these. And I think it's worth, putting the time in to do this. So it shall continue to be my kind of endeavour for the next several years. So thank you very much.